Half a century ago, during the peak of the Cold War, the world was at the brink of total annihilation, with the threats of nuclear bombs being dropped anywhere around the world at a moment's notice. Though the Cold War officially ended after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, things have begun heating up again. In today's political climate, there's been a rise of nationalism and distrust of other countries and their leaders. This has led to increased political tension worldwide, and some may argue we're amidst another Cold War. This time, instead of pointing missiles at each other, we're pointing our computers. This is the era of the Cyber Cold War. Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, 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 and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I'm your host, as always, Johnson Zen. And before I begin, I just want to thank you all so much for your support. Please, if you are enjoying this podcast, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe for more. Thank you. So, the Cold War. It's probably one of the most tension-riddled eras in modern history. You have these superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, and their respective allies in a nuclear arms race against each other. And basically, you can think of it as the US and Soviet Union pretty much just flexing at each other, trying to be the more macho one. The reason the Cold War was called a Cold War is because there was no direct fighting between the two countries and their allies. There were, however, different proxy wars in different countries all around the world to try to gain influence. If you're American like myself, then the ones that you're probably most familiar with are the Korean War, Vietnam War, and maybe the Afghan War. These were fought to try to spread or contain each country's respective political ideologies. And I just want to say that I am oversimplifying the Cold War because today I'm not going to be talking about the entire history of the Cold War, but rather I just wanted to give you a quick, brief refresher on what the Cold War was about, especially if you're like myself who was born after the Cold War had ended. The reason I brought up the brief history of the Cold War is because we're kind of in the middle of a Cold War right now. Well, it's not technically a Cold War, but it does have a lot of the same characteristics of a Cold War. And before I get too deep into this, I do want to give a disclaimer that I'm not trying to encourage any sort of conspiracy theories, nor am I trying to cause any sort of political strife one way or the other. I'm just here to present you some facts and my opinions on the situation at hand. And I guess with that said, let's get into this. So in the introduction and as well as the title of this episode, I think you probably have an idea of what sort of Cold War that I think that we're currently in right now. And for those of you who didn't get it, I think we're kind of in this gray area of cyber warfare against many different adversarial nations. And the reason I call this a cyber Cold War is because underneath the politics you see in the media, wherever you live in the world, your country is probably under attack by some sort of cyber attack. And conversely, your country is probably attacking another country cyberly as well. And whether you know that your country is doing this or not is irrelevant because the fact of the matter is we live in the 21st century and we are heavily dependent on the internet for our day-to-day lives. So it's not too far out from the realm of possibility that the different countries out there will try to take advantage of this and use the internet to adversely attack another country. I did mention that during the Cold War, competing nations didn't directly attack one another, which is a little different from what I'm describing in terms of what hackers are doing with their malicious cyber attacks. The similarity comes from the fact that, yes, hackers are directly attacking a country, But the actual hack isn't what's doing the damage, it's the information that is gained from the hack that does the most damage. And maybe cyber warfare isn't the most accurate nomenclature, but as I talk more about it, you'll kind of see some of the parallels with the Cold War. And you'll be surprised to hear that this is something that most people aren't aware that is happening. But news outlets have definitely talked about it, and there have been a lot of incidents related to cyber attacks. And I know I'm not talking about cyber attacks for monetary gain. What I'm talking about is cyber attacks for political gain. And the most recent major attack that broke into the mainstream is during the past presidential election, where Russian hackers allegedly influenced our election. And again, I don't want to get too political, but regardless of where you identify on the political spectrum, the facts do indicate that there was a deliberate cyber attack against the US during the election. And I'm not going to debate whether these attacks had any significant effect on the outcome of the election, because the important thing to note is that we were attacked. And of course, I say we, referring to us Americans. And no matter what your political ideology is, it should alarm you that there is a threat from the outside that is trying to undermine our political system. And this is where the parallels with the Cold War sort of come in. There's this sort of covert operation happening that is trying to gain political influence. Another example of this is in 2014 when North Korean hackers hacked Sony Pictures because of the movie The Interview, which was a comedy film where the main plot of the story was to assassinate the North Korean leader Kim Jong Un. And here, even though the target of the cyber attack was a private company, Sony Pictures, the motivation behind the attack was purely political. Obviously, with the mutual animosity between the United States and North Korea, North Korea took exception to a movie depicting the assassination of its leader and was politically motivated to make sure that the movie does not get shown in theaters. And of course, to have a war, there needs to be more than one side participating, and the US is no different in that it also attacks other countries online as well. And I can't really get into specifics with what kind of attacks the US is doing to other countries, but with government organizations like the NSA and CIA, in general, it's safe to assume that the US is actively participating in cyber warfare, whether that be offensively or defensively. It's safe to say that Russia, North Korea, and probably even China are most likely on the US's list of targets. And this sort of brings me to the next parallel with the Cold War, which is the arms race aspect. These cyber attacks by countries are not only trying to gain political influence, but also to try to get strategic military advantages. Espionage has been a part of any country's military or self defense and intelligence since way back when. The only difference today is that now all of our information is transmitted and stored digitally. So it's become imperative for nations to use hackers to try to steal military information. And one of the main concerns of this today, as well as it was during the Cold War, is technological espionage. If you're able to hack into the email of a top executive at a defense contractor that maybe builds ICBMs or intercontinental ballistic missiles, then you may be able to learn the secrets of how to build the weapon, or maybe learn how to defend against it. And learning how to build a weapon is important because, first off, it greatly reduces the research and development costs, which usually is the most expensive aspect of developing any new technology. And second, if you steal the techniques to make a weapon, then you can learn how to defend against it. And you will also have the weapon yourself without your adversary knowing that you actually have the weapon and that you can defend against it. And going back to the Cold War, The reason the Cold War escalated so quickly at the end of the Second World War was because the Soviet Union was able to steal the blueprints for building the atomic bomb through espionage. So they had the capability of causing mass destruction. And nowadays, with how complex technology has become, it's become much more important for countries like North Korea who don't have a lot of money to bypass the high cost of research and development. In order to compete militarily, they have to maybe steal or try to take another country's weapons development ideas or blueprints. And I'm not saying that their military technology is all stolen, but I think it's safe to say that they're not totally innocent when it comes to technological espionage. And the same goes with the US and pretty much every other country out there. So now let's kind of shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about different examples of the cyber Cold War that we're currently in. One incident back in around 2008, the Dalai Lama's email was hacked, and for 11 months, his emails were being monitored by the Chinese government. And just a brief background on the Dalai Lama's relationship with China. China basically has it out for the Dalai Lama because of how critical he was of China with the human rights violations against Tibet. There's a lot more to this than just that, and I don't have time to go over everything. So just know that China and the Dalai Lama's relationship isn't a very good one. Um, so what happened was that sometime in 2008, the Dalai Lama's email was hacked, or it also could have been one of his aides or something. So one of the inner people of the Dalai Lama's emails was hacked, and they found out about it because a country who shall not be named that the Dalai Lama was supposed to visit canceled its meeting with the Dalai Lama, and it was later revealed that that country received an email from China warning about the Dalai Lama's scheduled visit. And you could kind of consider it as political blackmail. But the reason this is so important is that the meeting that the Dalai Lama was supposed to have, it was not publicly known, and the only people that knew about the meeting was the Dalai Lama's inner circle. And of course, suspicious about this sudden cancellation, the Dalai Lama's team asked researchers and cyber analysts at the University of Toronto to look into this, and what they found was that Chinese hackers had hacked into the Dalai Lama's email and downloaded several important documents and attachments about that meeting. Of course, China outright denies these allegations, but the overwhelming circumstantial and concrete evidence supporting these allegations is irrefutable. Another extreme example of cyber warfare is when Russian hackers were able to hack into the Ukrainian army's database that controlled the targeting data for their rockets. This was during the height of the Crimea incident. So, what the Russians did was they destroyed these artillery rockets by giving them bad targeting data. The Russians claimed that they were able to destroy about 80% of the Ukrainian artillery. And this was another aspect of their cyber attack, which is misinformation. We, of course, don't know how many rockets Russia was able to destroy with this hack, but hearing that you lost 80% of your artillery really demoralizes you if you're a Ukrainian soldier. And again, with China, Russia completely denies that these attacks were conducted by them, even though the hacker had been traced back to have originated from Russia. And Russia even sort of boasted about it, which kind of brings me to the next really important point. And I'm sure you've probably been wondering, why aren't countries doing anything about these cyber attacks if they know who's conducting them? So the answer to that is, as you might expect, very complicated. It's easy to find out who did it, but it's very difficult to prove that the country of origin is behind the attack or was directly involved with the attack. To sort of illustrate this, let's go back to the Dalai Lama's email hack. So, after months of research into the hack, researchers were able to deduce that not only was the hack from China, they also pinpointed it to a small island in the China Sea. And surprise, surprise, the island also happens to be a Chinese military base. And you're probably thinking, we got them. It's the Chinese government for sure. Why don't we do anything about it then? And to that, I say, not so fast. This is all circumstantial evidence. It doesn't for sure prove that China was behind the email hack. And I know it's a little confusing, but legally speaking, circumstantial evidence is not enough to convict anyone of a crime. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, so please take this with a large grain of salt. Circumstantial evidence is evidence of facts from which inferences can be drawn or made. So let's say I declare at a party that I hated Bob and that I said I wanted to kill Bob. And I tell everyone that I love knives and I have a huge knife collection. The next day, Bob's found dead with a knife in his back. I can't be convicted of Bob's murder without more evidence, even though there is overwhelming circumstantial evidence against me. You can make inferences that I said that I wanted Bob dead and that I have a love for knives, but just because there's a connection between the two doesn't necessarily mean that I was the one who did it. And just FYI, I didn't kill Bob. But anyways, going back to the Dalai Lama, even though the circumstances against China was overwhelming, there isn't direct evidence that the Chinese government was actually behind the attack. It could have just been someone in the military base who just happens to dislike the Dalai Lama so much that he or she was so inclined to hack his email. And this was done, of course, without the consent and knowledge of the Chinese government, because in China, hacking is illegal, and individuals caught hacking will face major penalties. And of course, for those of you who didn't get that, I was being sarcastic. It's pretty obvious that, of course, the Chinese government was behind it, but the Chinese government is pretty much able to say, hey, we didn't do it. We didn't authorize a hack, and as a matter of fact, hacking is illegal in China. It must have been an individual completely independent of us that did it. And of course, we will look into the matter and we will bring the hacker to justice. But we can't guarantee that we'll find this hacker. But we can't guarantee that we'll find said hacker. And that's pretty much the end of the discussion. Of course, China will never find the hacker. So even though all signs point to China, it's impossible to actually prove that they were for sure behind it. And I want to reiterate this point again, that this is something that is not unique to just China. Pretty much every country with an intelligence agency is going to deny any sort of cyber attack they commit was authorized by the government. And to get this point across, in 2012, President Obama signed an agreement with China to be more strict about corporate espionage. This agreement was so that companies like Apple, who make their products in China, wouldn't have to worry about their product designs or technology being stolen or counterfeited. That agreement purposely did not include political espionage because nowadays it's sort of this open secret that all countries participate in some sort of cyber political espionage, but no one will admit it. And this point brings me back again to the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the US throughout the Cold War knew that the other country was spying on each other, And it was this open secret that the two countries were at odds with each other, but they never outright admitted it. And all the conflicts were at most passive aggressive moves through these proxy wars. And this is the same with cyber warfare. Cyber warfare will never directly ever attack a country, but it does do so in this sort of passive aggressive way. In the future, what is to become of cyber warfare and how will it evolve? I'm not sure about that. Chances are, if you're not a government official or someone that works in the military or maybe even a journalist, then you're probably not going to be a target of this political cyber warfare. What you need to be worried about is your everyday hacker that just wants your money or your identity or whatever. Just remember to be vigilant and never open email attachments from people you don't know. And check the emails that you're receiving to make sure you're not getting an email from someone who's posing as someone that you know. Maybe I'll talk about our own personal cybersecurity in another episode. But for now, thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your moment of Zen. And if you're in the US, happy Thanksgiving. Eat lots of turkey. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya!